One leaked email, $7 million, and a man who wouldn't stay silent. They tried to hide it in the corners of power, behind polished plaques and locked archives, shadowy donations, promises made off record. But J.D. Vance followed the paper trail, and when Yale turned its back on him, he turned the eyes of an entire country. He wasn't just uncovering a secret, he was confronting a system, one that rewards quiet obedience, buries dissent, and punishes anyone who dares to speak from the ground they came from. This isn't the version told at reunions. It won't be printed on the back of glossy donor reports. This is the version that lives in whispers until someone decides to speak it out loud. Though parts of this story are dramatized and imagined, the emotions behind it, the silence, the courage, the quiet war between belonging and betrayal, are all too real. It's a reflection of truths many have felt, even if not exactly as told. Because sometimes the only way to reveal what's hidden is through a story bold enough to go there. So ask yourself, what was in those files that made them erase his name before the world could hear his voice? Don't look away now. What they tried to erase might just be what we all need to hear. The black cab rolled to a slow stop on High Street, its wheels crunching over the last of the autumn leaves. J.D. Vance stepped out, one boot planted on centuries-old brick, the other still hovering, suspended in that brief, breathless moment between two worlds. Above him, Yale Law's Gothic towers stretched like the spines of some ancient cathedral. Shadows clung to the limestone archways. Golden plaques gleamed from their polished spots on the gates, each etched with names of donors whose surnames could launch senators or sink them. J.D. adjusted his worn duffel bag on his shoulder, the same one he carried back in Middletown, the same faded army patch stitched across the front. No one else around him seemed to carry anything with patches or scuffs. Students in crisp linen blazers and cashmere scarves flowed past, laughing in low tones that reeked of prep schools and private summers. They looked like they'd been born into the right rooms. J.D. looked like he'd wandered into one by mistake. He paused just past the gate, pretending to read a campus map bolted to a stone pillar, but really just trying to breathe. His mother used to say, "A door like that don't open for people like us." Well, it had. The question was, for how long? Inside the admissions hall, the air smelled faintly of lemon polish and ambition. An assistant with perfect posture handed him a packet and a smile that didn't quite touch her eyes. "Mr. Vance, welcome. You'll find your orientation schedule, campus code of conduct, and alumni networking guide in this folder." Her voice was syrupy. J.D. heard the unspoken part just beneath it. "Try not to break anything." The tour began. A student guide, Henry, an affable Bostonian who spoke like he'd done speech therapy at the Kennedy compound, led them past portraits of past deans and benefactors. J.D. recognized none of the names. But the others? They nodded, even whispered to each other. He was already behind, and class hadn't even started. Then came the first real cut. At the welcome reception that evening, under a chandelier so large it could have lit half of Kentucky, J.D. was sipping water from a glass that felt too thin for his calloused fingers. A professor approached him, gray suit, square glasses, the air of someone who read ancient Greek for fun. "You're the Marine from Ohio, yes?" J.D. nodded. "Yes, sir." The professor gave a dry smile. "We're glad to have you. Just remember," he paused, taking a slow sip from his wine glass, "you'll need to polish more than your resume here." J.D. held his expression, but his gut turned. What did that mean? His accent? His posture? His shoes from Target? What exactly was unpolished? He would lie awake that night, replaying that line again and again, until it burned into his chest like a brand. As he unpacked in the small dorm room, half the size of his uncle's garage, he stared at the walls. No posters, no flags, just silence. Somewhere, laughter drifted through the vent, a group of students watching an HBO documentary on Cold War diplomacy. J.D. opened his laptop. The screen blinked back at him. He clicked an old file, his personal statement. In it, he'd written about growing up in a house where books were rare, but arguments were loud, and about the one time he found a law textbook in a dumpster and kept it. He had poured his past into those pages. Now he wondered if Yale had only read it like an admissions novelty. Oh, how quaint. A real-life working-class applicant. Then he asked himself the question that would follow him like a shadow. Did they let me in so they could say they did? Or so they could change me? He didn't know it yet, but Yale would do both. And neither would go the way they planned. He didn't sleep much that first night. The professor's words echoed like footsteps down a marble hallway. You'll need to polish more than your resume. JD told himself it was nothing, just old guard snobbery. But in the days that followed, the message showed up everywhere. Not in sharp slaps, but in soft erasures. Not in what they said, but what they didn't. In the classroom, JD thrived. Cold call debates, constitutional analysis, even oral arguments, he came alive in them. Years of discipline, grit, and having to explain things to people who never gave him the benefit of the doubt had made him sharp, fast, unafraid to challenge the room. Professors took note. Some even nodded with quiet approval. But when the class ended and the leather-bound notebook snapped shut, the other world began. The one where his grades meant less than the summer stories traded over lunch. One afternoon in the courtyard, a group of students lingered under the elms. JD sat with them, uninvited but not unwelcome. The conversation drifted to Europe, the Paris internship, my summer at The Hague, my family's place in the Loire Valley. JD sipped his black coffee, listening. Someone turned to him. What did you do last summer, JD? He smiled lightly. Worked double shifts at the garage, helped pay off my mom's medical bills. The silence that followed wasn't cruel. It was worse. It was polite. One student nodded slowly, then turned the topic to Croatia. That was Yale, the softest walls you'll ever run into. It was also in the code of conduct, phrased in what they called professional neutrality. JD knew what that meant. Don't get too specific. Don't sound angry. Don't talk about real people with real bills. Don't say poor, say under-resourced. Don't say broken town, say rural America. One day, a student group invited JD to speak at a first-year symposium. The theme, Bridges Between Worlds. JD wrote the speech in one sitting. He talked about growing up around closed factories, about watching a neighbor get evicted with 3 kids and nowhere to go, about how he once thought law school was for the sons of judges, not the sons of addicts. He ended the speech with a single line, I am proud to come from Middletown, Ohio, and I carry it with me into every room they said I'd never enter. The next morning, he got an email from the student coordinator. It was polite, too polite. We absolutely love the story. It's powerful. We just wanted to flag one line near the end that might be read as a bit political. If possible, could you consider softening or removing the mention of your hometown and the phrase every room they said I'd never enter? Just to keep the tone inclusive. JD stared at the screen. His fingers hovered over the keyboard. He didn't reply. He didn't have to. The edit was the answer. They didn't mind where he came from, as long as he didn't say it out loud. They welcomed his presence, not his past, his resume, not his roots. He delivered the speech that week. He kept the line, and when he spoke it, he looked directly at the coordinator in the front row. The applause at the end was loud, but it felt like a curtain, not a bridge. Back in his room that night, JD sat by the window and watched the light on the tower flicker. Yale was teaching him more than tort law. It was teaching him how silence could be sculpted into policy, how erasure could be disguised as professionalism, and how acceptance could feel an awful lot like assimilation. And in that quiet moment, he made a vow. If they ever asked him to choose between who he was and what he'd become, he wouldn't flinch. The tower bells struck noon, ringing over old campus like a ceremonial drumbeat. JD adjusted his gown, the fabric stiff and unfamiliar against his skin. Outside Woolsey Hall, students lined up in polished rows, robes freshly pressed, honor cords glinting in the sun, and parents waiting with smartphones held high. JD scanned the crowd. No one there wore steel-toed boots. No one carried folding chairs from the back of a pickup truck. His mother couldn't make it. Doctor's appointments and unpaid time off didn't mix. His sister had mailed a card with $20 and the words, "Don't forget where you came from." He wouldn't. Not today. especially not today. The ceremony began with pomp and precision. Names were called. Cheers rose for legacies, scholarships, clerkships to the Supreme Court. JD's name landed like a pebble in a lake. One polite ripple, then stillness. He walked across the stage, chin level, heart tight. The dean smiled at him. Smaller than the smiles before him, smaller than the ones after. It wasn't hostile. It was reserved, like someone shaking hands with a wild card. As he stepped off the platform, a professor caught his arm. One JD had admired early on, sharp, articulate, and just distant enough to feel important. "You did well here," the professor said. "Your writing's strong. You'll go far." Then, almost as an afterthought, "Just don't turn it into a crusade." JD blinked. A crusade? The professor smiled as if offering a compliment, then turned and rejoined the faculty row. JD returned to his seat, diploma in hand, but his grip tightened. The paper felt heavy, not with pride but with paradox. They had taught him how to debate case law, how to draft arguments that danced inside the margins of elite respectability. They taught him how to sit at tables that once rejected his kind, and how not to say too much once he got there. But they hadn't taught him how to bring those tables back to Middletown. They hadn't shown him how to stand in rooms full of men who'd never missed a meal, and speak for the ones who skipped dinner so their kids didn't have to, because they couldn't teach that. That wasn't in the curriculum. Later, as graduates hugged and posed beside banners, JD slipped away to the far edge of campus. He walked past the law library's arched windows, past the statue of a blindfolded woman holding scales. He paused there, staring at that frozen image of justice. It looked so sure of itself, so polished, so perfectly blind. But JD wasn't blind anymore. He pulled off the gown and folded it over his arm, careful not to drag it on the ground. The diploma stayed tucked in its folder, unopened. That night, he sat alone on the dorm room bed, surrounded by boxed-up books and memories, not quite ready to leave. The room was stripped down now, bare walls, no trace of the long nights or the silent vows he made. He opened a notebook and wrote just one sentence. "They trained me how to think, but not who to fight for." And in that single line, JD knew. His real education was just beginning. The kind that didn't earn applause. The kind that might never fit in a frame, but it was his. 3 years had passed since JD last walked under the shadow of Yale's towers. But the marble still gleamed like it had something to prove. The invitation came in a navy blue envelope with gold embossed lettering, Yale Law Leadership Circle Annual Dinner, held at a private Manhattan ballroom overlooking the park. The words were flattering. The gesture appeared warm, but JD had learned by now. At Yale, kindness always wore a collar and came with expectations. Inside, the ballroom shimmered like a still lake under moonlight. Crystal chandeliers, soft piano echoing from the corner. Waiters in white gloves moved silently, pouring wine older than some of the interns in attendance. Every detail was precise, controlled, and expensive enough to whisper, "You don't belong here unless we let you." JD adjusted his tie, not new, just re-ironed, and walked to his assigned table. Table 9. The name card read, Mr. J.D. Vance, positioned neatly beside someone far less familiar. "Ah," the man said as JD sat, extending a hand with the confidence of a man who'd never second-guessed a word he said. "Carter Langston, hedge fund world, graduated '88. We usually donate anonymously, but for this crowd, they like names." JD nodded politely. The man reeked of cologne and comfort. Dinner began. Seared scallops arrived on beds of truffle polenta. Wine flowed. The table filled with talk, venture capital and climate tech, tax shelters in Singapore, and a recent foundation gala where someone's cousin gave a toast about educating the undercultured. JD said little at first. He was used to that, letting people underestimate him. It was useful. Then came the moment. Langston leaned in, voice just low enough to feel dangerous. "You know what the real problem is? These flyover folks," he said, swirling his glass. "Too much time, too little sense. You want to fix democracy? Pay them not to vote." Laughter followed. 3 guests chuckled into their cocktails. One woman winced but said nothing. JD looked at the glass in front of him. Perfectly clear, fragile, easy to shatter. He turned to Langston, voice calm but cutting. You ever been to Portsmouth, Ohio? Langston blinked. Can't say I have. What is that, some kind of camp? JD's smile didn't reach his eyes. It's a town. Population's dropped by half in 20 years. One pharmacy, 2 factories left. I know a guy there who works 16-hour shifts and still brings his daughter to school in the morning. He votes, and he earns it. The table went quiet. Even the piano seemed to soften as if listening. JD leaned in. People like him may not own hedge funds, but they carry more of this country on their backs than most of us in this room. So maybe the problem isn't that they vote, maybe it's that they still believe someone will listen. Langston shifted, lips tight. Well, that's a populist take if I've ever heard one. JD sipped his water and replied, No, that's a neighbor's take. The conversation drifted elsewhere, but the air had changed. JD knew it. He had just scratched the polish. That night, as he stepped out into the Manhattan wind, he looked up at the glowing skyline. They'd invited him here for his name, his title, his resume, but not for his truth, and he had just given them a taste of it anyway. The tension from JD's exchange with Langston still lingered like perfume that wouldn't fade. Forks clinked a little less. Conversation softened. JD wasn't naive. He knew how rooms like this worked. When the tone shifted, it didn't scream. It cooled. He thought he'd be left to finish his salmon in peace. But halfway through the main course, a woman in a pearl gray dress tapped a glass with her spoon. The ringing brought the room to attention. Before dessert, she smiled, we'd love a few words from someone who represents the next generation of Yale law leadership. Mr. J.D. Vance, would you honor us with a toast? A few polite claps followed. Heads turned. J.D. looked at her, then at the dean across the table, who gave a mild nod. The air thinned. He stood slowly. A waiter handed him a cordless microphone. His palms were dry, his voice steady. He looked out across the room. Dozens of alumni, donors, professors, partners in firms with names carved in marble. He had prepared no remarks, but something had been simmering since he walked in. Thank you, he began, raising his glass. To Yale, an institution that changes lives, opens doors, and teaches us how to think in the language of power. A few heads nodded. He paused, then pivoted. But I've also learned something else. Now the room leaned in. I've learned that brilliance, no matter how dazzling, means very little if it never leaves this room. If it doesn't walk into towns where the factories are quiet and the classrooms underfunded. If it doesn't lift the people who will never eat in this ballroom, never see their name on a donor wall, never be quoted in the Atlantic, then brilliance is just vanity with a diploma. Silence. No polite laughter. No champagne clinks. Just eyes. Some wide, some narrowed. JD glanced toward the dean's assistant, seated near the floral centerpiece. Her smile had tightened into a line. She shifted forward and mouthed, almost inaudibly, "Not the place. Not the time." JD continued anyway. I came here from a world most of you have never walked, where a win isn't a fellowship, it's keeping the lights on another month. And if we don't use what we've gained here to bridge that world in this one, then we haven't honored this place. We've just performed in it. He lowered his glass slightly. That's when it happened. The microphone flickered, once, then again. Then silence. Dead air. JD tapped it once, twice. No sound. Someone at the tech booth gestured, technical error. A few murmurs followed. A waiter stepped forward to clear the plates. A pianist resumed with a soft rendition of Clair de Lune, as if cued to cover the discomfort. JD looked down at the mic in his hand. The red light was still blinking, but no one would hear what came next, so he didn't say it. He simply set the mic on the table, sat down, and took a quiet sip of water. The conversation around him resumed, gently, deliberately, as if his words had been a momentary glitch in an otherwise flawless evening. The dean leaned toward his assistant, whispering something behind a folded napkin. JD looked out across the ballroom one last time. The chandeliers sparkled. The glasses were full. The smiles had returned. But something had cracked. Because brilliance might be vanity. But silence, weaponized, was something far worse. And JD had just learned what that sounded like. It didn't happen the next morning, or even the day after. The silence took its time, like a slow drip before the ceiling gives out. JD returned to his Senate office, back to the rhythm of hearings, policy briefings, and early morning phone calls from factory town mayors. But something lingered. He felt it in the way Yale stopped replying. 3 days after the dinner, his assistant dropped a letter on his desk, a formal envelope stamped with the crest of the Yale Law Alumni Council. Inside was a single page. Due to scheduling conflicts and evolving program priorities, the Yale Future Leaders Forum has decided to indefinitely postpone your upcoming keynote address. We appreciate your continued engagement with the institution and wish you well in your public service. JD stared at the letter for a long moment. No signature, no phone number, just absence wearing good manners. He read it twice, then a third time. He knew what postponed indefinitely meant. It was code, polite exile, just long enough to be forgotten. He had been slated to speak on public trust in the law, a topic he now understood far too well. Later that week, an email thread leaked anonymously to a small online publication focused on higher education watchdog reporting. At first, it barely made a ripple. Then it was picked up by a few blue-check Twitter accounts. Then it spread. The subject line read, "Concerns re Vance appearance." The sender, a major Yale donor. Name redacted. Message clear. We don't need another populist firebrand ruining the brand. Our stage isn't for crusades. It was the second time he'd heard that word. Crusade. JD closed his laptop and let the room go still. Across from him, framed on the wall, hung a photo from his days in Middletown. Him and his cousin fixing a busted Chevy in the snow. Sleeves rolled up, faces smeared with grease and effort. They weren't thinking about legacy. They were just trying to get somewhere. He ran his fingers across the edge of the desk. Polished oak, just like the ballroom table, just like the podium they'd taken away. He'd touched a nerve, and not because his words were loud, but because they echoed someone they'd tried hard to forget. In interviews, when asked about the fallout, JD gave the same answer every time. They didn't just dislike what I said, they hated who it reminded them of. And who was that? The factory worker with bad knees who still showed up on time. The waitress working doubles while learning case law at night. The kid who learned about justice from a worn-out library card and a locked front door. JD didn't need their podium, but the fact that they pulled it back told him everything. It meant his words had landed. It meant the mask had slipped. In a way, he was grateful. Now at least no one was pretending. It came in a plain white envelope. No crest, no embossed signature. Just JD Vance's name typed across the front and a prepaid postage mark from New Haven. The kind of envelope you'd toss in a stack of campaign junk mail if you weren't looking closely. He opened it at the kitchen counter, coffee still warm beside him. He didn't expect much. Perhaps another lukewarm alumni fundraiser, or a notice about an endowment dinner he wouldn't attend. But the tone changed quickly after the first line. We write to inform you that your name has been removed from the Yale Law Distinguished Alumni Registry as part of our periodic review and realignment of the list scope. That was it. No explanation, no signature, no invitation to appeal. Just silence pressed into paper. JD let the letter hover in his hand for a moment before setting it down beside the coffee mug. His eyes didn't narrow. His shoulders didn't tense. The blow didn't land like an ambush, because deep down he had expected this. The toast, the leaked email, the withdrawn speech. Yale had been erasing him in pieces. Now it had simply finished the job. He picked up the letter again and flipped it over. Blank. No watermark, no crest of honor. Just absence, scrubbed clean of pretense. He smiled to himself, not because it was funny, but because it was exactly how power moved when it wanted to leave no fingerprints. He took out his phone, snapped a photo of the letter, and opened his social media app. The caption? Just one word. Noted. He didn't add hashtags, didn't tag Yale. He didn't need to. Within 20 minutes, the image had been shared over 3,000 times, In an hour, political commentators were retweeting it with their own interpretations. Supporters from his home state called it petty. Critics called it predictable. But what rang loudest wasn't outrage. It was recognition. People had seen this play before. The quiet cutting away of people who speak too plainly. The redefinition of excellence to fit whatever made the donors most comfortable. The subtle excommunication not from faith, but from prestige. Later that day, a journalist from a regional paper called to ask for comment. "Do you feel disappointed?" she asked. JD paused. "No," he said. "Not disappointed, just confirmed." Confirmed that it had never been about merit, that all the handshakes and polite applause had been conditional, that he had always been welcome, as long as he stayed useful and quiet. The next morning, a thick alumni magazine arrived in the mail. The cover headline read, "Honoring the Legacy of Excellence." Inside was a 4-page spread celebrating distinguished graduates in law and public service. JD's name wasn't listed, but he found space for a 27-year-old clerk who had just joined an international arbitration firm and a think tank scholar whose work JD had once challenged on air. He closed the magazine, then opened a drawer and pulled out a manila folder labeled Yale. Inside were old photos, a copy of his admission letter, a snapshot of him in cap and gown. He slipped the removal letter on top and sealed the folder shut. He wasn't angry, he was clear. They had erased his name from a list, but in doing so, they'd engraved something much deeper, that what he stood for no longer fit inside their frame, and that, more than anything, was the beginning, not the end, of something far more honest. 2 days after the removal letter, JD sat at his home office desk, eyes fixed on his laptop screen. The house was quiet, just the soft ticking of the wall clock and the occasional creak of pipes. It had been gnawing at him since he posted the letter. Not the silence, but the question underneath it. How far were they willing to go to erase a name? He clicked open Yale's official alumni site. Search bar, JD Vance. Nothing. He tried again. Vance, JD. One link appeared, a 3-year-old article with a broken thumbnail and a title that led to a 404 error. JD leaned forward, brow tight. He clicked into the events archive, the listing of past speakers at alumni symposiums, keynote guests, and featured panels. His appearance from 2 years ago, gone. So was the transcript of his Q&A on public service in underserved communities. The video link he remembered sharing with his interns? Dead. He searched YouTube next. His speech at the 2019 Yale Public Policy Roundtable, once hosted on the university's official channel, was marked private. Not deleted, just hidden, like someone wanted it gone but didn't want to admit it ever existed. He sat back in his chair, arms crossed. It was surgical, quiet, precise, deniable. No statement, no headlines, just a slow unspooling of everything that once tied his name to theirs. He picked up the phone and dialed the Yale Alumni Relations Office. A woman answered with the kind of voice that smiled before it spoke. Yale Advancement and Alumni. This is Clara. Hi, Clara, JD said evenly. This is JD Vance. I'm calling because I noticed several of my prior engagements and listings have disappeared from the university's official archives. I wanted to check if that's a glitch or something else. There was a pause. Oh, Mr. Vance. Yes, I believe we're undergoing a digital refresh across our platforms, streamlining branding and updating archived content for clarity and consistency. JD let the silence sit for a beat. Then he said calmly, "Truth doesn't refresh well, does it?" Clara didn't respond right away. He heard a faint typing noise, notes being logged. "We appreciate your call," she said. "I'll be sure to pass your inquiry along." "I'm sure you will." He hung up and stared at the screen again. The blinking cursor in the search bar looked like it was waiting for something more. Another question he hadn't asked yet. But JD wasn't searching anymore. He'd found his answer. It wasn't just erasure, it was rewriting. You couldn't control what someone said in a ballroom, but you could delete the link to it afterward. You could pretend it never happened. As long as there was no record, there was no threat. And as long as no one asked why, there was no shame. JD opened his file drawer and pulled out the transcript from that 2019 roundtable. The one now scrubbed from Yale's site. He'd printed it the night it was uploaded, something his wife had teased him about at the time. Who prints YouTube transcripts? She'd laughed. He did, because he'd grown up around people who knew that truth often vanished quietly and that keeping a copy was its own kind of armor. He slipped the paper into a fresh folder, labeled it, "What They Forgot to Forget." Then he placed it gently next to the one marked Yale. Let them polish their archives, he thought. He would keep the rough edges. The sun had already dipped below the rooftops when JD's phone rang. It was a number he didn't recognize. New Haven area code, but unlisted. He almost let it go to voicemail. Almost. But something in him, maybe the same instinct that kept the old transcripts, the old letters, made him answer. Vance here. There was a pause, then a low voice, cautious and familiar. Don't say my name, the voice said, and don't record this. JD froze. Okay, he said, standing slowly, moving to the far corner of the room. I used to work in Yale Law Communications. I left last year, but I still talk to people, development staff, donor liaisons, policy advisors. I saw your name on a list. It's real, JD. It's not a glitch. It's not a rebrand. It's a purge. JD didn't speak. The voice kept going, like it had waited too long to be heard. There's a spreadsheet, internal, not official. It tracks alumni flagged as non-cooperative, politically misaligned, or potential reputational risk. It started small back in the Bush years, but it's grown, quietly, efficiently. JD sat down, his hand clenched around the armrest. You're on it now, the voice said. Your profile, your digital links, the archives, someone marked you for removal. It's not just about your politics. It's about control. You spoke without asking permission. And the letter? JD asked, already knowing the answer. Standard template. They send one every year or so. Anyone who becomes a problem gets it. Most people don't go public. You did. JD let the silence stretch. The ticking clock in his office filled the space. Why are you telling me this? The voice on the line hesitated, then sighed. Because I remember when you spoke on campus your first year in office. You said, I'm not here because I rose above where I'm from. I'm here because I refuse to leave it behind. I believed that, still do. Then softly, be careful. They won't fight you in public. They'll just erase you until you disappear. The line went dead. JD sat motionless for a long while. Not angry, not even shocked. Just sure of what he'd felt since the ballroom. Sure of what he'd seen in the vanishing videos, the broken links, the silence dressed up as decorum. This wasn't backlash. It was erasure, conducted not with outrage, but with orchestration. He stood up, opened his drawer, and pulled out the letter from Yale, the one with no signature, no seal. He held it in both hands like something delicate. Then he walked to the far corner of his office, where the wall remained bare except for one small nail from a frame that used to hold a family photo. He removed the photo, slid the letter into the frame, hung it right in its place. The paper sat crooked behind the glass, like it didn't quite belong there, which made it perfect. JD stared at it for a long moment. That piece of paper wasn't a rejection. It was confirmation that he had said something too true, that he had stood too firmly, that he reminded them of a world they didn't want to see reflected in their own. Let them have their registry. Let them edit the archives and clean their digital halls. He would keep the original. He would hang it on the wall, not as a wound, but as a reminder. They had crossed him off their list, so he had created his own. 3 mornings after he framed the letter, JD found a package waiting on the steps of his office. No postage, no tracking number, no sender. Just a thick brown envelope sealed with clear tape, the kind used for storage or silence. It was early. The building was quiet. JD unlocked his door, stepped inside, and laid the envelope on his desk like it might bite. The weight was odd, too light for a book, too heavy for junk. He ran his thumb along the edge, peeled the seal, and slid the contents free. One glance, and the world tilted. Inside were printouts, dozens of them, emails, meeting memos, subject lines clipped and buried between long chains of institutional language. He sifted through, heartbeat rising as the patterns emerged. Subject: foreign influence concern, donor discretion advised. 2. Vice Provost, Yale Advancement. From Strategic Affairs, Yale Development Office. The message was short, clinical. Recent coverage of J.D. Vance and increased political unpredictability. Given our ongoing partnerships and anticipated funding cycles, particularly involving foreign entities, recommend re-evaluating visibility of alumni figures flagged for volatility. Please proceed with quiet discretion. J.D. froze. There it was in ink and timestamp. Not a conspiracy theory, not a suspicion, a directive. Real names, real departments, a machine humming behind curtains. He kept reading. While Vance has demonstrated influence in working-class spheres, his public tone increasingly alienates key institutional partners and global donors. The previous association may reflect poorly. Strategic distancing advised. There were emails from assistant deans forwarding articles about his recent speeches. Notes in the margins. Risk to messaging. Too populist. Not brand aligned. One note scribbled in pen at the bottom of a scanned memo chilled him more than the rest. Let him drift. Starve the narrative. No confrontation. Just remove the spotlight. J.D. leaned back in his chair. The letter on the wall behind him, framed in passive aggression, suddenly looked like the tip of something deeper. This wasn't just about Yale protecting itself from controversy. This was about shielding its financial arteries from scrutiny, from challenge, from the kind of truth that J.D. refused to dilute. His name hadn't been erased because of how he spoke. It was because of who might stop giving money if he kept being heard. He shuffled through the last few pages. There were donation summaries, redacted, but not enough. He recognized names, corporations, a foreign tech foundation flagged last year for suspected ties to government surveillance. J.D. had raised concerns about it in a Senate briefing just weeks before his speech was pulled. He looked up at the framed letter again. The irony stung. They hadn't just erased him. They'd erased him to keep someone else's money clean. He stood, ran a hand down his face, and glanced at the window. The street outside looked normal. Morning light, people walking dogs, a bus pulling to the curb. But inside his office, a fuse had been lit. He didn't know who sent the envelope. No note, no trace. Just the truth, dropped on his desk like a match waiting for a spark. And now it burned. J.D. didn't leave his office that day. He brewed another pot of black coffee, closed the blinds, and spread the documents across his desk like pieces of a broken blueprint. He wasn't just reading anymore. He was reconstructing a system. Near the middle of the stack, buried between CC'd chains and finance committee briefs, he found the thread, the one that didn't just explain his erasure, but connected it to something far more dangerous. Subject: Strategic Coordination, Shanghai Initiative Sender, Yale Global Development Liaison, to Vice Provost Strategic Partners Office. It began plainly, cloaked in bureaucratic civility. Per prior agreements, we are aligning communications and public engagement with our international counterparts. Sensitivities around political narratives remain high, especially with regard to alumni visibility. But the attachments told a sharper story. A memo titled Quiet Influence Objectives, Phase 2, detailed how Yale had partnered with a major Chinese tech conglomerate, one J.D. had directly questioned during a Senate cybersecurity hearing months earlier. The language was cautious but revealing. Maintain cultural receptivity by limiting exposure to alumni engaged in nationalistic, populist, or critical rhetoric. J.D. leaned in, jaw tightening. Next to the name J.D. Vance, a note appeared in bold red font. Not aligned with global interests. Recommends step-back strategy. He kept reading. Another internal memo flagged several public figures associated with increased nationalist sentiment. J.D.'s name was at the top of the list. Below it, an outline for communication staff on how to proactively decenter alumni whose narratives do not serve expansion partnerships. Decenter. The word tasted like dust in his mouth. It was sterilized exile, erasure by euphemism. There were financial trails too. Donation flows rerouted through educational foundations based offshore, ones with clean paperwork, distant origins, and carefully scrubbed timelines. Yale wasn't just benefiting from global money, it was adjusting its public posture to keep the cash flowing unchallenged. JD flipped to a page labeled Outreach Risk Matrix. His face was there, a photo from his book launch. Next to it, a rating, Engagement Risk High. He exhaled slowly. This wasn't paranoia. It wasn't politics. It was strategy, designed, deliberate, and deeply funded. The institution that once asked him to speak on public trust had now decided he was a liability to theirs. And for what? For calling out foreign money in public hearings? For speaking too plainly about the working class in rooms lined with velvet and silence? For reminding Yale that its prestige was built on stories like his, stories they no longer wanted retold? He stood and paced the room, the papers still rustling behind him. The walls felt closer now, not claustrophobic, but urgent. Every name he'd once admired was on a list, copied into a thread, looped into the calculus of compromise. He returned to his desk, picked up the final page. No letterhead, no title, just 3 words typed at the bottom in plain, unstyled font. He's not helpful. That was all it took. 3 words to erase a decade of loyalty, a lifetime of grit, a degree earned one sleepless night at a time. Not helpful. To who? To what? He folded the documents carefully and placed them in a new folder, separate from the rest. Then he looked up at the letter still framed on his wall, the one that started it all. They thought they were removing a problem. But what they'd done was expose the architecture. The folder sat closed on the kitchen table, its corners already softening from how many times JD had opened and closed it in the last hour. The sun had gone down without him noticing, and the only light now came from the stove's overhead lamp, casting a pale halo on the documents beneath it. His wife stood across from him, arms folded, her eyes steady but concerned. She didn't have to read the papers to understand what they meant. She could read him instead, the stiffness in his shoulders, the stillness in his hands. JD only got this quiet when he was about to do something irreversible. "I need you to hear this," she said, voice low. "If you go public with that, you don't just go after Yale. You go after their donors. You go after names that sit on campaign finance committees. This could bury your Senate run before it even begins." JD didn't look up right away. He stared at the folder. The weight of it wasn't just in the contents, it was in what it demanded of him. Because once you knew something like this, you couldn't unknow it. And once you stayed silent, you were no longer just a witness. You were part of the design. He finally lifted his gaze. His voice was calm but certain. "Then maybe I was meant for something else." She blinked but said nothing. "They let me in," he continued, "as proof that the system could still work. One poor kid in a room full of legacies. But they never expected that kid to start asking what the room was hiding." He paused, then added, "Now I know." He stood, picked up the folder, and walked into his office. The framed letter stared back at him from the wall, silent and smug. He'd left it there as a reminder, but tonight it felt more like permission. He opened his drawer and pulled out a business card, dog-eared, edges faded. The name on it was a journalist he'd met once in a DC hallway, someone who specialized in following the stories no one wanted to touch until they exploded. JD sat at his desk, stared at the number, and for the first time in the long arc of this story, didn't hesitate. He dialed. 3 rings. Then a voice answered. "This is Thomas." JD leaned forward. "I think I have something you'll want to see." A pause. "Can you tell me what it's about?" JD looked at the framed letter, at the folder, at everything that had led to this moment. "It's about how truth gets buried in buildings with gold plaques and donor walls, and how some of us still carry shovels." There was silence on the line. Then, "I'm listening." JD exhaled. It was done. The first move made. The door opened. Not the kind Yale polished for press tours, but the kind that led into storms. He knew what would come next. Denials, dismissals, maybe worse. But none of that mattered anymore, because the real decision had already been made. Not tonight, but years ago. The first time he walked through a gate they said wasn't made for people like him. They gave him their degree, but they never thought he'd use it like this. The hearing room wasn't full yet, but the air already felt heavy. JD sat at the witness table beneath the Capitol dome, fingers steepled, his face calm but unreadable. Across from him, senators murmured among themselves. Aides darted back and forth. Cameras were setting up behind the rail. It wasn't a hearing about Yale, not officially. The title was neutral enough. Foreign Influence and Institutional Transparency in Higher Education. But everyone in the room already knew who and what this was about. JD had declined all interviews before the hearing. No op-eds, no press leaks. He had let the envelope of documents speak through one source, the record, and today that record would begin in his voice. The chairman tapped the gavel. This committee will come to order. Mr. Vance, the floor is yours. JD adjusted the microphone. No paper in front of him, just the folder, worn, annotated, and unflinchingly real. I want to start by saying I never expected to be here under these circumstances, he began. Yale Law School gave me opportunity. It opened doors I had only read about. But somewhere between those doors in this room, I learned something else. Access can be revoked the moment truth becomes inconvenient. The room stilled. He opened the folder and pulled out a single sheet, the one labeled "Not Aligned with Global Interests." This is an internal communication from Yale's Global Development Office, he said. It suggests adjusting alumni visibility to protect international donor relationships, particularly with a tech conglomerate tied to a foreign government. That conglomerate was flagged by U.S. intelligence for surveillance risks, right before my name was quietly erased from every platform tied to the university. Gasps were muffled behind phones and notepads. A senator whispered to his aide. JD continued, voice firm. Let me be clear. This isn't about one school. This is about a system of selective silence, where elite institutions sell access and reputation in exchange for influence that cannot be questioned, and when someone does question it, even respectfully, they're removed. He held up another sheet, the memo labeled Quiet Influence Objectives, Phase 2. This outlines coordination with said donor to manage public narratives. The language is sanitized, dissenter outspoken figures, limit reputational risk, but the effect is surgical, targeted, and invisible to the public. He paused, letting the words settle. And that's the point, isn't it? The room was listening now. All of it. He looked directly at the row of senators. If you're afraid of transparency, you never deserve public trust. Silence. Then a rustle of movement. Someone coughed. A photographer's flash popped from the gallery. JD didn't flinch. This isn't about me, he said. This is about how truth is managed in spaces that claim to teach it. It's about the people who can't afford lawyers or microphones, but still get steamrolled by the ripple effects of unchecked influence. If elite universities want to shape American leadership, they need to be held to the same ethical light we demand of the leaders they produce. He closed the folder gently. I came here today not to reclaim a name, but to protect what it once stood for. The chairman leaned forward, hands clasped. Thank you, Senator Vance. As JD stood, his eyes swept the chamber. Some looked away. Others stared too long. But somewhere near the back, he caught a glance from a young staffer. Notebook gripped tight, lips pressed in awe. JD knew that look. It was the look of someone who hadn't expected to hear something that real in a room that polished. The hearing ended at 11:52 a.m. By 12:07, the clip of JD Vance holding up the internal memo, his voice calm, his lines sharp as a blade, was already clipped, captioned, and shared. If you're afraid of transparency, you never deserve public trust. It landed like a punch, and the internet flinched. Within an hour, it had crossed 1 million views. By evening, it was headline news. Washington Post, Senator Vance accuses Yale of donor-driven censorship. Politico, leaked emails, show Ivy League scrubbing alumni for foreign partnerships. Fox News, they tried to erase me. JD Vance goes nuclear on Yale CNN. Yale denies allegations, says documents lack context. Yale's first response came just before prime time. A university spokesperson appeared on a curated campus lawn, framed by ivy-covered walls and controlled lighting. Her expression was diplomatic, her tone rehearsed. These claims are based on misinterpreted documents and cherry-picked emails taken out of context, she said. Yale remains committed to academic integrity and freedom of thought. Any suggestion otherwise is categorically false. But they didn't deny the documents were real. And in the age of screenshots, that mattered. The leak spread, activists shared folder copies, anonymous insiders began to surface. A former communications officer emailed an independent journalist. "We knew about the list." It wasn't formal, but everyone understood what names to avoid. Another former faculty advisor confirmed the phrase, "not aligned with global interests," had appeared in internal guidance more than once, particularly when international donations were being finalized. The hashtag began to trend that night. Hashtag erase but louder. It started as a whisper. Then someone found the archived video of JD's earlier Yale speech, the one that had disappeared from their site. A user reposted it with the caption, "This was the speech they buried. Now it's everywhere." Tens of thousands shared it in hours. On TikTok, a stitched video compared JD's Senate testimony with an earlier TED Talk by a Yale trustee boasting about balancing global partnerships with institutional values. The contradiction was stark. The comments were brutal. Even those who didn't agree with JD politically couldn't ignore the core of it. Why was a U.S. senator being erased by the very school that once held him up as proof of the American dream? Late that night, JD sat alone in his office, watching the numbers rise. The original clip, now dubbed the Yale moment, had passed 5 million views. Supporters sent screenshots of students staging silent walkouts on Ivy League campuses. One group at Columbia projected "Truth doesn't refresh well" onto a library wall. He didn't smile, not yet. He knew storms like this moved fast, but institutions move slowly. They'd wait. They'd study the public pulse. Then they'd respond not with accountability, but containment. Still, something had shifted, not just because the documents were out, but because people cared, and not just about Yale, but about everything it symbolized. Control dressed as civility, money dressed as merit, erasure dressed as policy. He picked up his phone, opened Twitter, typed 2 words. "Still standing," hit post, no hashtags, no tags. The message was clear enough. Outside, thunder rolled low in the distance. Real or metaphorical, it didn't matter. The air had changed, and this time, JD wasn't the only one who felt it. By the third morning of media chaos, Yale struck back. It arrived not through press conference or podcasts, but in the New York Times Sunday opinion section, printed above the fold under the byline of Dean Harlan Wentworth III. The headline read, "When prestige is weaponized, Mr. Vance in the dangerous game of populist rhetoric." It was classic Ivy, measured, articulate, and laced with poison dressed as prose. The opening paragraph invoked shared tradition, the burden of representation, and mischaracterizations too reckless to ignore. But the core message burned through the diplomatic gauze by the third paragraph. Mr. Vance, though once a proud product of this institution, has chosen to distort and demean the very values that allowed him to rise. His recent claims, couched in the language of justice, reflect not accountability, but ambition. JD read the piece at his kitchen counter, the paper folded beside a black coffee growing cold. His wife stood behind him, arms crossed. "It's elegant," she muttered. "In the same way arsenic is colorless." The dean's op-ed continued with clipped calm, denying any intentional suppression while admitting to routine archival adjustments. He cited context, nuance, and unintended consequences. Nowhere did he deny the documents were authentic, but the line that struck deepest came near the end. "We at Yale do not fear transparency. We fear when it is twisted into a weapon, wielded without wisdom, and aimed not at justice, but at spectacle." JD folded the paper once, cleanly, and pushed it aside. He opened his laptop, logged into his public newsletter, and began typing. Not with rage, with clarity. The kind of clarity you earn from silence, loss, and long memory. Subject, a response to the dean. "Let me be plain. I didn't distort Yale's values. I revealed how far it has drifted from them. When alumni are removed for being inconvenient, when public speech is rewritten in private rooms, when foreign money speaks louder than American voices, that's not tradition, that's betrayal. You say I demean the institution, But I only held up a mirror. If the reflection stings, it's not the mirror's fault. You say my words were reckless, but the real danger isn't what I said. It's what you hoped would never be said at all. I tell the truth you wish had stayed in Latin. J.D. Vance. He hit publish. Within the hour it was trending. Hashtag truth in Latin, hashtag not just ambition, hashtag Dean V's Vance pundits flooded panels. Some praised the dean's composure, calling J.D. a political opportunist exploiting his education for rebellion. Others said Yale's op-ed was the most polished admission of guilt they'd ever seen. J.D.'s inbox exploded. Messages from veterans, single moms, blue-collar workers, first-gen students. They didn't quote legal theory. They said things like, "We see what they tried to do to you, and we've lived it." Late that night, a high school civics teacher from Iowa posted a photo of his whiteboard. On it, scrawled in chalk, "I tell the truth you wish had stayed in Latin." Discuss. J.D. stared at that image longer than he expected. This was no longer about an email leak or a canceled speech. It was about who got to define leadership in America and who they tried to silence when that definition cracked. The dean had signed his name to legacy. J.D. had signed his to a fight. The sun broke gently across the Capitol, casting long shadows through J.D.'s Senate office windows. Outside, the city throbbed with movement. Interns rushing lattes, aides balancing briefcases and buzzing phones. Cameras still parked outside, hoping for another statement. But inside, J.D. worked alone. He had arrived early, hours before the first briefing, long before the halls would fill with noise and posture. The quiet suited him. It reminded him of early mornings in Middletown, when the town was still asleep, and the only sound was the rattle of newspaper trucks on the corner. He stood in front of the far wall, blank, clean, untouched. Until now. He carried 2 frames under one arm. Neither held awards, neither displayed commendations or degrees. The first, the removal letter from Yale, still crisp, still unsigned, still as cold and formal as the day it arrived. A letter that had said everything by saying nothing. The second, the donor chart, the leaked document outlining the money trail, coded in euphemisms and footnotes, showing just how far an institution would bend to stay comfortable. The page was marked in yellow, the phrase not aligned with global interests circled twice. He hung them side by side. Then he stepped back, measured the distance, and retrieved the final piece. A carved wooden plaque, smooth but bold, the grain of it stained darker than the walls. On it, etched with precision, "They erased my name, so I wrote it louder." He mounted it beneath the frames, drilled in carefully. Not a nail out of place. He stood for a long while staring at what he had made. Most senators filled their walls with framed magazine covers, endorsement letters, or posed handshakes with powerful people. But J.D. had no interest in that. This wall didn't celebrate power. It remembered why it needed to be challenged. When his chief of staff walked in 20 minutes later, he froze. "You want me to move that? Or?" J.D. didn't look away from the wall. "No," he said quietly. "I want it to be the first thing every guest sees, even before the desk, even before the flag, because that wall was no longer just a reminder of what had been taken. It was proof of what they hadn't broken." J.D. stepped away and returned to his chair, but he wasn't done. He reached into a drawer and pulled out a slim black notebook, the kind he kept private. He flipped past pages of speech notes, scribbled town hall questions, and half-outlined policy memos. Then slowly he wrote, "You cannot erase a man whose memory belongs to the people who were never allowed in the room." He underlined it once, closed the notebook. Outside his window, the Capitol was waking up, reporters checking their notes, students gathering for the morning tour. Someone waved at the building, camera phone lifted. Somewhere the storm was still swirling, hashtags still flying, op-eds still being drafted. But in this room, in this quiet, framed corner, something had landed. Not a victory, not yet, but a claim. J.D. didn't need a list to prove his value. He had built a wall that could not be edited, and now every visitor would know. This office didn't belong to prestige. It belonged to a voice that refused to be silenced. 3 weeks after the hearing, JD found himself back in Ohio, rural, overcast, and honest in all the ways Washington never managed to be. The air smelled like farmland and wet pavement. A small local high school had invited him to speak, not through an official request, but through a handwritten letter from a sophomore named Kelsey, folded neatly and mailed with a 10-cent stamp. "We watched your speech in our civics class. Our teacher cried a little. Would you ever come talk to us?" He had read it twice, then said yes. The school gym still had fold-out bleachers, rusted trophy cases, and banners faded from years of heat and basketball sweat. Maybe 50 students were there, along with a few teachers and one local paper reporter holding a voice recorder with duct tape across the back. JD wore no tie, no podium, just jeans and a rolled-sleeve shirt. He told them stories, not about policy or votes, but about growing up on expired cereal and figuring out the FAFSA on a library computer. He talked about the first time someone called him Senator and how it still felt like they were addressing someone standing behind him. They laughed at the right moments, went quiet when he mentioned what Yale had done. These kids knew about being erased, not by universities but by geography, by opportunity, by being left off maps where funding decisions were made. At the end, the civics teacher, Mrs. Hadley, opened it up for questions. Most were polite, some were curious, but the last one came from a boy in the back. Ball cap, scuffed boots, sleeves rolled past his elbows. He stood awkwardly, like speaking felt bigger than it should have. "Are you still proud you went there?" he asked. "To Yale, I mean." The gym went still. JD looked at the boy for a long moment, then said slowly, "That's a good question." He let the pause sit. Let it earn the weight it needed. "I'm proud I got in," he said, "because it proved the door could open." He took a step forward. "I'm proud I survived it, because not all of us do." Then he looked around the room, at every flannel shirt and worn-out hoodie, every lunchbox stacked by the door. "But most of all, I'm proud I left different than I entered. I didn't come out of Yale polished. I came out clearer." The boy nodded once, like he understood exactly what that meant. Afterward, as students filtered out, one girl handed JD a folded sheet of notebook paper. "It's not a letter," she said. "It's a quote." Later on the plane, JD unfolded it. In pencil, block letters, "They taught you how to think, but you taught us how to speak." He stared at it a long time. Then he tucked it into his wallet behind his ID. Somewhere up in the sky, between Washington and Ohio, he realized something. Yale may have erased his name from their list, but they had accidentally written it into a generation of kids who would never forget what they saw when someone like them stood tall in a place that told him to sit down. It was nearly closing time on a quiet Tuesday when JD's assistant knocked once, then leaned into his office with a raised brow. "There's someone here to see you," she said. "Didn't have an appointment. Says he's from Yale." JD looked up from a policy draft, brow furrowed. "A student?" "No," she said. "Older. Professor, maybe." He stood instinctively, the pen still in his hand, its ink smudging the corner of the page he'd been editing. "Let him in." But when he stepped into the hallway, the man was already walking away. Gray coat buttoned, leather satchel in hand, his gait marked by years and thought. JD recognized him immediately. Professor Alton Price. Constitutional theory, Yale law, stern voice, impeccable handwriting, and the kind of mind that could deconstruct legal precedent like peeling layers off a fruit. Years ago, he had once told JD in a seminar, "Your fire is admirable, but it'll burn you first." It wasn't cruel, just clinical. "Professor," JD called out. Price stopped, turned, and for a moment, the years between them seemed to evaporate. "You've got a wall now," the professor said softly, nodding toward the framed documents visible through the office doorway. "They say what plaques can't." JD didn't smile. He didn't need to. "You came a long way to say that?" Price shook his head. "Didn't come to say anything." He reached into his coat pocket, pulled out a folded sheet of ivory stationery, and placed it on the corner of the reception desk. "I just needed to stand here and leave that." JD took a step forward, but the professor was already turning, already walking away. No cameras, no handshake, no press quote, just footsteps fading into the hum of the hallway. Back inside, JD waited a moment before unfolding the paper. The handwriting was unmistakable, precise, angled, exacting. Just one line. You were the student I should have listened to. No name, no date. But JD didn't need either. He sat down, the office quiet except for the muted ticking of the wall clock. He read the line again, then once more. For all the debates, the public denials, the published op-eds, it was this sentence, written in quiet ink, not broadcast from a podium, that landed deepest. Because it wasn't just about him. It was about what changed when someone who had been certain chose to reconsider. He folded the note carefully and placed it inside the drawer below the framed letter on the wall. Not because it erased what had happened, but because it marked that something, however small, had shifted. Later that night, as the city lights blinked into evening, JD sat alone, reflecting not on vengeance or vindication, but on that most elusive of victories. A mind reopened. He knew the fights ahead would be louder, harsher, more visible. But this quiet moment with no press release, no trend, no applause, this felt like something rare. Not reversal, recognition. And recognition, JD had learned, was harder to earn than any degree. The envelope was thin, creased, slightly smudged, and addressed in careful, almost nervous handwriting. It had no return address, just a Kansas postmark dated 3 days ago. JD opened it expecting another constituent inquiry or polite support note. But this one was different. Inside was a single page folded twice, lined notebook paper, written in blue ink, not typed. The letter read, Mr. Vance, they took your microphone, but you made us listen. My school didn't teach us what you said. My textbooks didn't print it. But when I saw your name disappear, I looked for the videos. I read everything. It made me feel like maybe the people in charge don't get to define who we remember. We do. I want to be someone who listens louder. Sincerely, Maya, age 16, Kansas. JD read it 3 times. Not because the handwriting was hard to read, but because something in the last sentence punched through him. A 16-year-old girl, writing from the middle of the country, had found not just his story, but her own voice inside it. He sat back in his chair, holding the letter with both hands like it might tear from too much feeling. Outside his window, the Capitol dome stood still, unmoved. But inside, something softened. Not pride, not vindication, something quieter. Relevance. For all the speeches, the hearings, the headlines, this was the only echo that truly mattered. A voice far from the ivy towers and the committee rooms, whispering back, "We heard you." He folded the letter gently and placed it in the drawer with the others, next to the note from Professor Price, beneath the donor chart Yale tried to bury. He didn't say a word, but in that silence JD smiled, because they'd tried to erase him from history, and a teenager had just written him back into it. No formal reason, no direct denial, just emails that went unanswered. Messages politely deflected, invitations that suddenly didn't materialize. JD had prepared the speech anyway, printed it out, and saved it on his desk with a post-it. Someday. That day came on a crisp autumn morning in a fairground outside Wheeling, West Virginia. It wasn't ivy-covered, and there were no mahogany chairs or velvet podiums, just folding chairs, dusty boots, ball caps, and steelworker jackets. A veterans rally. When they asked JD if he wanted to speak, he didn't hesitate. He reached into his briefcase, pulled out the same wrinkled pages, creased from waiting, and stepped onto a low plywood platform with no microphone stand. He didn't need one. He began the speech he wrote for Yale. But this time, it was different. Because here, it didn't land like theory. It landed like truth finally given a place to breathe. They told me I needed to soften my tone, that I'd never build coalitions if I kept bringing up where I'm from. I told them this: if brilliance doesn't lift the forgotten, it's just vanity in a cap and gown. And if remembering your hometown makes you too political, then maybe politics forgot who it's supposed to serve. There were no polite nods. There were head shakes, fist pumps, a few silent tears. Someone muttered, "Finally?" By the final paragraph, the crowd wasn't still. They were leaning forward. "They tried to deny me their stage," JD said, voice firm, unshaking. "But I didn't need theirs. I had yours." A local news crew recorded it. A teen live-streamed it on TikTok. Within 48 hours, it had 5.2 million views and was dubbed the speech that didn't need Yale. JD didn't post about it. He didn't respond to headlines. He didn't need to. The words had gone out, and this time nobody could mute them. The town hall was standing room only. Folding chairs filled the gymnasium of a small high school in rural West Virginia, the kind where the American flag hung crooked but proud above a faded basketball scoreboard. There was no fanfare, no opening act, just JD. He didn't wear a suit, no tie, just rolled sleeves, worn boots, and a voice that had been sharpened by silence. There were no cue cards, no teleprompter, just a stool, a bottle of water, and a crowd that looked more like his cousins than his colleagues. He stood in front of the bleachers, cleared his throat, and paused. Then he said simply, "They called me forgettable, but you remembered me, and that's all I needed." There was no eruption of applause, just a slow, rising standing ovation. Not choreographed, not polite, earned. Afterward, people lined up, not to shake hands but to share stories. A grandfather who'd worked in the mines for 40 years. A single mother who'd voted for the first time because of what you said about voice. A teacher who used JD's story in a civics lesson titled, "What Happens When You Don't Disappear." One little boy, maybe 10, gave him a folded napkin with a drawing of JD in a speech bubble that said, "You're loud, but nice." JD laughed and folded it into his pocket. Later that night, as he stood alone outside under the stars, his wife joined him. They didn't speak for a while, just looked at the town glowing soft and proud behind them. Then she said, "You were never just fighting Yale, were you?" He shook his head. "I was fighting the silence that comes after people give up." She rested her head on his shoulder, and JD knew then. He didn't need every name back on the roster. He didn't need his picture in the hallway. He didn't need an apology or a headline. He had something better. Proof that once you spark a movement, it writes its own ending. And sometimes that ending isn't a shout. It's a whisper passed between strangers, a note from Kansas, a town hall with no script, a drawing on a napkin. That's how legacy lives, not on plaques, but in people. So when JD finally turned to head home, he didn't look back at the crowd, or the lights, or the cameras. He looked ahead. Because movements don't stay in one place, they move forward, and his had just begun. This story reminds us that legacy isn't something granted by institutions. It's built through conviction, courage, and consistency. JD didn't fight for applause, he stood for the unheard. Even when the doors of power closed on him, he opened new ones with truth. What moves me most is that his loudest moment came not from a podium, but from being remembered by those who needed him most. In a world eager to erase dissenting voices, this story dares to say, erasure fails when memory lives on. What about you? Have you ever felt silenced, but found your voice through someone else's courage? If this story touches you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to JD Stories, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching JD Stories.